Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second AI show where myself and Kevin Kieller will be digging into some of the latest AI news headlines, followed by a conversation with Dr. Joseph Williams, Information and Communications Technology Sector Lead and Tech Policy Advisor to Governor Inslee for the state of Washington. And together we're going to be getting into the lowdown on some of the latest AI security considerations, privacy and legal issues. And what you need to be thinking about. So stand by for that. Welcome to our second show, Kevin. How's it going?
Well, it's going well, Rob. I'm glad we made it through the first show, and here we are.
We did indeed. And what a great show that was. We will put a link in the description to that previous show, just in case you did miss it. But either way, lots happening in the AI space, lots of news rolling out, Kevin. I know we've got some headlines to talk through today. I mean, the first one that I wanted to jump into was that, the fact that AI is coming and Apple says the M4 chip makes the iPads AI ready kind of news headline that we posted recently. I mean, it feels like Apple are really going to put AI into our pockets. And I was wondering if we could just talk through maybe some of the advantages of that and having all that compute power in the palm of our hands. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the new iPads and with this M4 chip, I mean, they have a tremendous amount of horsepower. So I went after the announcement, the recent announcement, and, you can really trick those things out, 2 terabytes of solid state and some new nanometer screen. It gets really, really expensive really fast. But clearly, there is a tremendous amount of horsepower. But right now, from an AI perspective, I mean, Apple has really been focused on, what I often refer to as more of the behind the scenes AI in terms of some of the, image editing and auto zooming and framing and, picture and video enhancements. They really haven't been out there with respect to generative AI, although allegedly they have an Apple GPT that they run internally. I think they're positioning themselves and their devices well to be able to run significant language models on the device. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the AI minute, but one of the reasons you'd like to do that is because running it locally, if you have the horsepower, from a security perspective, you're not sending information into the cloud, such as like biometric information that you may not want to do that. And also just from a latency perspective, or when you don't have connectivity. So they're positioning things well. What the M4 chip will do with all that horsepower, I think they've got a June 10th Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, and I expect then to hear more about, okay, how do you harness the power that is there.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's always been Apple's kind of model and a strategy to put that compute power in the palm of your hand, not just in the cloud, right? So do you feel like this is is this kind of what we can expect from things going forward? Do you think we're going to have more kind of AI in our pocket versus in the cloud, or do you think it'll just be an ongoing combination of the two?
I think, the right place for AI is both on the edge and in the cloud. And I think what we're seeing is as, people are figuring out with different models tuned for different things, with different use cases, where do you want to do that? And, so with devices, there's a lot of good reasons to have it on the edge on the device. And there are some things that you can still only do and you want to do in the cloud. So I think going forward, we're going to see AI in many different devices from very small to very large in the cloud.
Yeah, it's getting pretty exciting though. It's great to see. Moving on to our second story, Kevin, this was an interesting one. I picked off the BBC of all places, which was about a huge $1 billion investment that Microsoft and NVIDIA have just made in an automobile company called Wave, that I suppose an AI automobile company, which is really interesting. What's your take on that story? I was kind of like interested in, knowing, are all these huge investments going to get a bit of a cold shower at some point, like maybe the metaverse did, or do we think that these type of investments are just going to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at that space, funding for this, AI driven auto driving, according to like a database was showing that it fell 65% between 2021 and 2023. So this is really notable that there is this, large investment. I mean, I think we've all, watched Tesla and the perpetual delay of their self-driving, vehicles. Certainly in recent months, like Apple and General Motors both abandoned their driverless car projects. So this is kind of bucking the trend. It's ended up being a harder problem, especially the edge cases. So when there's constructions and cones and, people people doing nasty things like putting a cone on a driverless car or a driverless taxi, which then causes the taxi to think that it needs to stop, right? I think that these cases have turned out to be a lot harder than many wanted them to be or anticipated. So this is great for, for Waves, and it'll be interesting to see if they can, kind of crack the code with. I think one of the things, maybe they're trying to leverage some of this new generative AI in different ways. So, maybe this unique approach will bear fruit where others have found just obstacles.
Well, I'm sure they'll be making waves in the future of automobile technology. What do you think?
There you go.
I had to grab that one. Okay. Well, interesting story. Love those big investments. Lots happening, especially in that space. But let's move on to a Microsoft story that we were talking about on the Microsoft Teams show recently, Kevin, which was centered around their earnings call and the fact that nearly 60% of the Fortune 500 now use Microsoft Copilot. I know you caught hold of that headline. What's your take on that? And, I really love all these use cases that Microsoft keep kind of showcasing, especially on their AI in action page. But I was kind of keen to understand, are these just numbers, or is this reality? Is this really happening?
Well, I'm actually surprised that only 60%, because I imagine it'd be like 100% across, there's like 20 co-pilots that are add-on licenses or what have you. And especially like 90% of the Fortune 500, I believe, is using GitHub. And certainly that was the original Copilot that came out in 2021. So that's been around for a number of years and really has some quantitative metrics to prove that it greatly increases productivity from a coding perspective. So I think 60% is low. Certainly, Satya on the earnings call, like the first sentence was talking about the Microsoft Cloud that's up 23%, 35 billion for the quarter. And then he immediately connects it to Copilot, which he now, I think all these Copilots, Satya referred to it as, and this is the first time I've heard him use this term, as a Copilot stack, which I guess is all these Copilots that you can pay a lot of different licensing fees for. But, I think everyone really should be experimenting with these different AI tools, whether it's Copilot because you're in the Microsoft ecosystem or some of these other AI assistants, because they are going to fundamentally improve specific use cases. And Satya, actually, when you talk about in finance, when you talk about inventory turns, it's how quickly do you kind of go through your inventory, and you want to have more turns because more just in time. So he's talking about how Copilot is driving knowledge turns. So this whole concept of learning from experience and then pushing the knowledge barrier boundary forward. So he's saying that the Copilot stack is going to drive these knowledge turns. I think that is the case. And so, as I said, 60% of the Fortune 500 using Copilot seems actually low to me.
Well, I mean, Microsoft weren't just in the news for their earnings recently, were they either? And on UC Today, we reported a rumor that Microsoft were actually building their own AI model. So rather than using OpenAI's ChatGPT engine to power Copilot, could they be potentially working on their own platform solution? What do you think, Kevin?
Well, I mean, it's 100% clear. Microsoft's building a lot of models. So, they're building like Orca 2, which is a small language model. Um, there's a lot of different models that are being tuned for different use cases. And certainly with the recent hire of Mustafi Soliman, who was the co-founder of Google DeepMind, and then went on to create Inflection.ai, which you can go over to Inflection.ai and try the AI assistant that they created, which was more focused on kind of the being more of a companion, more of the emotional quotient as opposed to just simply, kind of the IQ facts based. And it does have a different, feel when you interact with it. So with Mustafi Salman coming over, the rumor as well was that the model might be called MAI1. Maybe that stands for Mustafa AI1. Other members of the Inflection team came over as well. And I did go over to Inflection.ai, and their AI assistant is called Pi. And I did ask about this rumor, and it came back and it said, wow, you're really up on the latest rumors. I haven't heard anything specific, but it wouldn't surprise me if Microsoft is working on something like that. And then I asked about the naming, and it said, given Mustafa's past work with DeepMind and Inflection AI and his emphasis on empathy in AI, it's certainly possible that MAI1, if it exists, might incorporate EQ training, and it may actually be named after him. But remember, this is what the chatbot told me, this is all speculation at this point. So even AI chatbots are somewhat into and up on the rumors. But I think Microsoft is going to continue to push many models forward because, I think we're moving into where people are optimizing different use cases for different models, both from a latency, from a quality, and also from a cost perspective.
Yeah, it is a really interesting story, and I think you're right. It's they're going to have fingers in all pies, I would imagine, over the next few years. So, really interesting news. Lots coming down the line as well. But let's go over to our AI minute with Kevin. So, Kevin, first of all, this is a word or phrase that we hear that needs demystifying, I suppose. So, Kevin, what is today's word, and why does it matter, and why do our audience need to know this one?
Yeah, so we talk about these large language models, but, I just wanted to kind of drill down a little bit on this. So really these are models, they're a category of models that are trained on immense amounts of data, often billions of pages worth. And it turns out that this makes them capable of natural language understanding and generation. So this is all the excitement around the Gen AI, right? But, large language models, they're built using a neural network, which is a structure that's modeled after our own brain's biology, well, ours and other animals' brain biologies, with connections between these different nodes. And if you wonder, for example, like Chat GPT, we say that a lot, but the GPT part stands for specifically a type of large language model that uses a neural network, a generative pre-trained transformer model. So that's where the GPT comes from. But, we go to the age-old question, Rob, does size matter? So what makes a large language model large? Well, it turns out that there's not an exact definition, but really it's this number of parameters. These are kind of the nodes with the different weights that get built as you train them. Over time, kind of the definition has grown. So if we look at certain models, Google came out originally with a BERT and a large BERT model. They had 110 million and 340 million parameters respectively, and they were considered large language models. Maybe now not so much. GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters. GPT-4, the thinking is that it has around 1.76 trillion. Llama 3 that was released by Meta recently, they created an 8 billion and 70 billion parameters. So you can see these are big numbers. And then Google Gemini, they have, different models, the Ultra with the most 540 billion, the Pro and the Nano models. But, the truth of the matter is The other thing that makes them large is, it's not only about the parameters, bigger isn't always better. It's also about the quality and quantity of the training data used. But any of these LLMs use a tremendous amount of training data, which means a huge amount of, computing and infrastructure that's needed to train these models. So that brings us to this question of, okay, but what about small language models? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of research. I know Microsoft, we talked about Microsoft. Microsoft research is really looking at, okay, how small can a model be and how large does, as we scale it up, when does it start to show some of these capabilities that we look for in a large language model? And are there ways to reduce the size without reducing the capabilities? And so small language models, in general right now would be, anything, sometimes said anything under 10 billion parameters, but, certainly things in the hundreds of millions parameters. And, I mentioned it in response to the other question that you asked. I think increasingly the future is really not so much about saying, let's use the biggest model, but really finding, the right model or models for a specific use case, because there's a lot of fascinating things where people are using smaller models, quite capable models on edge devices for latency. Certainly, for example, in a self-driving car, you don't want to have to go up to the cloud, or if you lose a Wi-Fi connection, you have to do things in real time, which means more, potentially tuned and smaller models that are more real time. And then even when you look even to tiny machine language models that might exist on IoT controllers, so think in smart devices. So we're going to see a whole range, and really, like all technology, it's about using the right tool for the job. So that's a little bit about large language models. And with that, we're done with the AI minute. That probably took 2 or 3 minutes.
Perfect, Kevin. Thank you so much. And I was really astounded recently when I found out there's over 100 LLMs out there right now, which is a huge amount to kind of figure out. And I'm sure we're all going to need some serious AI training at some point. But in the meantime, let's move over to our guest speaker slot. So I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Williams, Information and Communications Technology Sector Lead and Tech Policy Advisor to Governor Inslee for the state of Washington. So welcome, Joseph. How's it going?
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Joseph. I mean, we had kind of dug into some of the technical pieces, but I know, data security and privacy, and there's a variety of legal issues that really are important for organizations to consider, when they're trying to leverage AI, whether they're using, these pre-trained AI assistants or whether they're building their own, AI models. So let's talk about these different areas, if that's okay with you, because I know this is certainly something you focus on in your role.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity here, and it's early days.
Well, and I think that's really important for kind of the audience to understand. So if we start with data security and AI, what should organizations be thinking about? And, from your perspective, are there areas where organizations in general are not paying enough attention?
Well, I think it's fair to say, based on what's happening at Microsoft, since you mentioned them so often, they've suddenly woken up to the importance of security, and they've made it. Well, they say it's job one; it's really not, but it's a priority, right?
Right.
So what's happening here is, let's talk data first. I have data that I'm training my model with, and I potentially am violating copyright or trademarks in order to get that data. So there are all kinds of legal cases which are in play right now. Microsoft's being sued by a lot of online publishers for theft of data or appropriation of data. That's one. Second, the user of the data is providing information to the AI model. So if Kevin does something, I know that Kevin has an interest in XYZ because that's what he's asked me to do. What do I do with that information? Is that information protected? Can I use that can I monetize that? Can I sell it? Probably can, actually, given the end user agreements. The other thing that's going to happen is there's learning that goes on. You mentioned it, Tesla earlier. Teslas aren't really AI focused; they're really kind of rules based. But there is learning that goes on as they go into these code situations and things like that. They're learning. What
Right.
happens to that learning? Who owns the data around the learning, and where does it go? How do we keep that private? Does it need to be kept private? Again, all kinds of open issues. None of this is resolved. Even the new EU's AI law doesn't address this very well. We'll see what happens when they actually bring compliance cases against companies and users.
So you mentioned all these lawsuits, for example, and I know that fair use and copyright, it's super complicated. It varies based on what country you're in, and it hasn't been litigated. So is this, when you say we have to see what happens, is it whether there just has to be court cases that set precedent, or are organizations? You asked a lot of good questions, but with few answers. So what are organizations to do? Do they wait, or, some analysts have suggested that, the first, this first batch of LLMs, they're all going to crash and burn because they're going to be sued out of existence. And then there'll be models that are trained on, data where they have copyright. So I don't know.
So two forces are in play here. One is the regulatory/compliance environment. It could very well be that countries or states immunize these large language models so they don't get sued. So there is some relief through regulation, right? Or air cover, if you will. The other side of it is, it has to get litigated. Until it goes through the courts, we really don't know what the actual liability will be for these things. We really don't know. Even like GDPR and CPRA, the privacy laws that have been there the longest, still haven't been litigated fully. So we're still in early investigatory mode. And then if you look at countries like China, which has the PIPL, the PIPL rules, they seem very flexible. So they seem to be whatever the Chinese regulators want it to be. And so if you're deploying an LLM in China, you got to be very careful that you aren't going to run afoul, not of the law as written, but as the law is interpreted. Does that make sense?
Well, it sounds very complicated, right? Which I think is an accurate summation of from kind of both the country and organizational level.
Let me just jump in there. So somebody, not the software designer, has to do the risk analysis. If this thing goes afoul, what is our potential liability? So the Air Canada case, which is very famous now, where the chatbot was quoting the wrong price and then they had to honor it and they took a bath on that. What is the risk of having my AI do something that's going to cost me money? And that needs to be quantified and that needs to be analyzed. And I would not advise a client to just deploy an AI in the absence of the risk assessment.
No, that makes sense. It was interesting because, as you know, I'm based out of, just outside of Toronto, Canada. So, of course, Air Canada being a national carrier, I go to Enterprise Connect at the end of March, and this story is talked about so often and used as an example of, AI run afoul and what have you. Which I found fascinating because, it turns out it was a small claims court judgment. The chatbot, had told somebody that they were eligible for a bereavement discount. So the total award was $812.02 Canadian, which is, $100 US now. It's more than that. Which I found, fascinating simply because it created so much press. I saw an article on the BBC. It was certainly picked up by the US press, but I think it is a good cautionary tale, especially when you build a model and deploy it externally, because in this ruling, it was said the chatbot is acting as an agent of the organization. So it's just as if some human had responded to an email and told the person this, you need to kind of honor what your chatbot says. So you have to make sure it's saying the right things.
Yeah, you're talking about agency law there, but there's also tort law, Kevin. I mean, what if you mentioned earlier empathy? What if I have an empathy bot and it's trying to help me deal with an emotional problem that I need to work through, and I end up killing myself as a result? What's the legal liability there of the company, of the provider, of anybody involved in that department? We don't know. However, really good legal scholars who are doing derivative analysis think there's probably a liability there.
Yes, fascinating. So
Now,
let's
the question is, does Microsoft have the liability, or does the third party who developed the empathy bot have the liability? And nobody knows that one yet.
right. And I know Microsoft is trying to, is indemnifying organizations for specific use of the Azure, AI models and what have you. But once again, I think it's complicated until it's tested. I don't think anybody knows exactly how that would play out.
That's correct. And it's absolutely true. Google, Microsoft, all of them are coming up with indemnification clauses that hold them harmless, but the courts will pierce that potentially.
Right.
Right.
So if we drill down into, privacy, so this was more at the organizational level, but from an individual perspective, how do you see AI impacting employee privacy? Because I find a lot of times when I talk to people, it's like the early days of chat. People would, like in an email, they would never put something that they didn't want other people to read. But in a chat message, they would say things that they definitely didn't want other people in the organization to read, because for some reason they believed that organizations weren't, capturing and those chat messages. And I find, that individuals seem to think that with prompts that they're, using their corporate supplied AI assistant, they somehow think that that's private to them. So, how does these AI tools impact employee privacy? So from an individual perspective, what should we all be thinking about?
So this is going to be place-based, Kevin. In the United States, there is no employee right to privacy. It just doesn't exist. It does exist in other countries. So it's going to depend on where the employee is sitting, how the employee is protected by whatever national or regional law that comes into effect. And you're absolutely right. Employees are, we use the U.S. as an example. Employees are at some risk if they use AI. The company's going to be aware of it. They're going to be able to figure out how it's been used. I just read an article this morning that said most employees are actually using private AI. They use their own AI and then bring the results to work, because that gives them better control over what they're doing. And they don't want the company to know how they're using AI. And then as a result, there are some very large Fortune 500 companies that now prohibit that. They basically, you must use our AI tools.
Well, because of course there's this whole problem of shadow AI. If one thing, like let's say I'm involved in a merger and acquisition that I'm supposed to keep under the covers, but I paste it into the public version of ChatGPT and say, please summarize this and whatever I ask. I mean, now all of a sudden that's gone outside, or, that intellectual property has gone outside my corporate barriers. So I think, what I see is that organizations, it's like if you don't provide tools for your employees, they're going to find the tools, in the public space, and those may not be, the ones you want them to be using, right? So
that's absolutely true. But there's the other angle on this, and again, I'll use U.S. law. If I'm trying to if my company's trying to defend itself for what it did, and you brought in your private AI, I may have a liability that you've created that I can't account for. And that's another motivation for companies to say, I really need to have control over what you're doing here. Again, with the lack of precedent, we just don't know where this is going to head.
Yeah, so definitely some things that need to be considered. In the broader cybersecurity, just to kind of, there's talk of, AI being embedded into security products to improve the ability to detect, kind of bad actors. But from your perspective, is that balancing out the things that bad actors can do with generative AI in terms of launching security attacks or, being able to identify weaknesses that, may have existed, but now is AI helping the bad actors be able to penetrate and identify some of these weaknesses more easily?
So, RSAC is going on right now, the RSA conference.
Right.
And I'm not there this year, but from what I've read, everything is about AI this year. And I'm not surprised. I was at Hanover Messe a week and a half ago in Germany. Everything was AI. But what that really means is that companies like CrowdStrike and Palo Alto Networks are trying to build some sort of learning and scaling capability into their product line. But at the same time, the hackers are doing that as well. I mean, the hackers have access to very good tools. They're not constrained by any kind of ethical boundary. And so what we're going to get, and this has already been foreshadowed, is we're going to get AI versus AI in the cybersecurity realm. The really scary thing is, and this hasn't happened, but so I'm just using a hypothetical, but suppose CrowdStrike has an AI tool that a hacker gets a hold of and now is able to use the AI against itself.
Right.
That is super troubling. Not only because you've now compromised the product's AI, but you now have access to whatever the AI is able to generate. And you now may have access to the way it's processing data, and you could produce very interestingly troubling outcomes as a result. And given that some of the hackers are state funded, I mean, we're not talking about kids in basements. Well, we are talking about them. And there are some kids in basements doing bad things, but there's whole buildings in some of our adversaries' countries that are just focused on hacking these things. So, I think the other side of AI and cybersecurity is so there was a lot of theoretical work done in the 90s about penetrating networks and then just monitoring everything and learning from what you could observe and then transmit the information back to somebody who could then take advantage of that information to do things.
Right.
That was actually doable. It was used in some adversarial environments, but now it's super easy. And so where it used to take an entire military complex to do something, that kid in the basement now has access to tools that may make that possible. And as long as you're patient, you can learn a lot from what an AI system is doing and use that against the company. And I think that's going to be troubling. Imagine, Kevin, if you monitored everything happening in teams,
right,
and you had some kind of AI that was able to figure out what the conversations were, and you were able to predict an acquisition that was going to happen. So effectively you create AI-based insider trading information.
Yeah.
That's a lot of liability.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so definitely you've given us, everybody, some things to think about. So when you net it out, Joseph, are you pessimistic, optimistic, somewhere in between? How do you, when you look kind of over the next several years in this AI space, how are you feeling about it?
Well, the ChatGPT phenomena is 18 months old, right?
Yep.
And we've seen this huge rush to LLMs that has been super exciting. So that part's very exciting. We're figuring out what these are capable of doing. We're figuring out the use cases. So we're in the process of monetizing. That part's very exciting. Security and liability always run behind. And so the pessimistic side is, all right, what are going to be the boundaries we're going to have to work with? Which is why I tell all of my clients, focus on risk assessment.
Right.
Go ahead and move forward, but pay attention to what you're actually doing and what potentially could happen and go wrong. And then insure against it or mitigate it as best you can.
Well, that seems like great advice and a great way to wrap up this particular episode. Rob, any concluding thoughts?
Hey, what a great session, Joseph. thank you so much for joining us. Kevin, as always, been a great co-host, and the 1 minute insight was always is always appreciated. But thanks to everyone for watching our AI show again. If you've got some good takeaways from today's session, do give us a quick mention on social, and you can always connect with myself or Kevin on LinkedIn, and our links are in the description. So thanks for watching.